Woo! Trying to find my way, 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 trying to find my way. I'm trying, change me.
My faith is in God alone, beyond a reasonable doubt. This brainstorm, pouring rain on your season of drought. Just trying to lay a couple seeds in the mouth. Thanks for listening. You ever get the feeling you was missing?
What up, y'all? It's your hometown hero, Scott Lane, the Black Bruce Wayne, a.k.a. the real Adam Coleman. So, you ride with Tru-ID. And, we keeping it rolling, man. Keeping it rolling with this social justice series. Been having a blast doing that. Having, just a lot of great feedback from it, man. Like I said, I think, probably either in the last episode or the one before that, this is actually a topic I kind of, to some degree shied away from for a while, simply because there were just a lot of, moving parts to it that I kind of wanted to chew on and wrap my mind around before I really kind of, put my foot down in terms of where I'm, at on certain things. And, the other side of it is I think there's so many, voices out there, that are some thoughtful, some careless, and, folks just kind of talking past each other. I just kind of, was focused on some other things. It just, from an apologetic standpoint, but just given the conversation that's going on right now with the, just social justice is just in the air, and unfortunately you have a lot of contention within the body of Christ, in terms of people taking a stance that the kinds of causes that individuals in the body of Christ are standing for, they believe to be, unbiblical, whether it be addressing, police brutality or just a number of different things. It just seems that people are overlaying these things with a political lens rather than looking at it from a biblical standpoint, and then condemning people who don't share or don't occupy the same end of the political spectrum as they do. I think that's kind of going on both ways. So I think that's just really muddied the biblical waters in terms of what it is that the church should be doing, at this time. And I think that term church gets thrown around sometimes in a way that makes it seem more weighted toward being like in an institutional sense, where the church is like this entity, like this institution. But, there's also, biblically speaking, this layer of the church, where it talks about just the people of God. What should the people of God be doing in the earth? And I think that, what we should be doing in the earth, unfortunately, like I said, it has been steered by things that are outside of the mandates of Scripture. And some of those things being political persuasions, whether somebody be a conservative or a liberal or so on and so forth, these things seem to be driving the boat. So on the one hand, I think that that's something, it's causing problems, man. It's causing the body of Christ to be misrepresented, and for the gospel even, I think, to be misrepresented in the public square. And as a result, you have people like I've been talking about, throughout this series, particularly in the African American communities, and just maybe I could say urban areas more broadly. People coming away with erroneous ideas about what Christianity is all about what the biblical worldview is all about what God is all about. Taking it that either God is distant and really doesn't give a crap about Black people, and or minorities more broadly, and the conditions that folks are facing, in this life, or on the opposite end, some people are taking their agendas, right, that really have nothing to do with Christ, and then imposing Christ on it as if it's something that Scripture would have us to be interested in or advocating. So it's just a lot going on, man. There's a lot going on, and I kind of just wanted to give my 2 cents on it, because I get these questions all the time. I get questions all the time in terms of, where do I stand on this or where do I stand on that? And it's funny because people want to get you like on their side, so to speak. And then they get disappointed when you disagree. And it's like all of a sudden, like now I'm just this irrational person just because I'm not as militant as you want me to be, or as subdued as you want me to be, in reference to, conservatism or what have you. I can't speak on certain things or else I'm not a good Christian or I'm not a good, thoughtful person or whatever. It's just silly stuff like that, so kind of just want to put my thoughts out there. So, on the one end, that's kind of what we're doing. But, in addition to that, like we've talked about is, we have people with these erroneous ideas about Christianity. We want to correct that. I want to set the record straight in terms of what the biblical worldview has to offer, in terms of navigating the moral issues of the, I guess, Black experience, if you will. Looking at Black history here in the West, there are a lot of bumps and bruises. And what does the biblical worldview have to say about that? Past, present, and moving forward. Does the Bible offer a model for how to engage injustice and the conditions that African Americans have found themselves in? What does the Bible have to say about that? I'm of the persuasion that the Bible has quite a bit to say. I think that a robust understanding of Scripture will lead you to come to the conclusion that I have, that the Bible has plenty of resources ideologically to help us to be morally responsible and potent, within our context wherever we find ourselves, for moral change, and bring about the kinds of goodness and things that reflect God's character in such a way that, ultimately, you'll see the flourishing, human flourishing and well-being and things of that nature to the glory of Christ, to the glory of Christ. So anyway, so that's what we're doing here, man. So last episode, talked a little bit about, John MacArthur and some of the things that he said, and just pretty much, basically what I just broke down just now. And, I talked about how over the next couple of episodes, what I want to do is start unpacking, these, I keep referring to the resources that within the biblical worldview to address moral issues. So I kind of want to start unpacking those, right? Want to talk about that a little bit. And, basically what I'm going to be doing is over the next couple of episodes is kind of just like building blocks. We're going to be going one by one through a number of different concepts in Scripture, and piece together a framework by which we can engage moral and social justice issues and so on and so forth. So just for a matter of clarity, right? I want to just go ahead and restate my definition of social justice. Social justice as I've defined it, right? So I'm referring to it as I'm kind of playing with the name, but maybe redemptive social justice, or I'll just call it biblical, maybe just biblical social justice for now. And maybe I'll come up with a cooler, more exotic sounding name later on. But when I say social justice, I'm referring to, basically what I'm referring to is this, exemplifying God's love and character by doing justice and righteousness in the context of one's sphere of influence in society, such that one's actions reflect, establish, and or advances the kingdom of God. So it's not just doing good deeds for good deeds' sake, right? It's all about fulfilling, like what Christ talked about, doing good works before men so that your Father in heaven may be glorified. That's really where we're coming from with that. So that's kind of that's what I'm talking about when I mention social justice. And I think that in these discussions, one thing that gets overlooked is definitions. People are hasty to use a term and assume that their understanding of what XYZ means is, just the default definition of this or that, And I think that we have to be careful as we're engaging people who disagree with us and may see things differently than we do. Don't assume that you're on the same page. Just because you're using the same verbiage doesn't mean you're on necessarily the same page in terms of what it is that you're talking about. What you want to do is kind of take it step by step, and make sure you're understanding, okay, when you use this term or when you use that term, here's what you mean, and if you're unclear on what somebody means, ask questions, because as I'm listening to, just different people talking this issue, you got different definitions of social justice floating around. but people are using the term as if they're talking about the same thing. And I think that's really the source of a lot of the confusion, But anyway, with that being said, I want to lay out some building blocks to, a biblical account of social justice, right? And then actually in the next episode, I mean, y'all know how I am, man. I'm a naturally contentious person, so I can't go through this whole social justice series, without taking a couple jabs at some of these conscious community groups. It's just not in me to do that. So, in the next episode, I'm going to be taking a look at a comparative study, if you will, of some of the other worldviews that are competing for Black people's attention, and just demonstrate how they fall short of providing ample or solid ground for a moral framework or a framework for social justice. We're going to be taking a look at that. So, now with that being said, let me just go ahead and just kind of get into the nitty gritty here, right? I should say, just as by way of disclaimer, that some of our Tru-ID episodes are very history heavy, right? While others are more philosophy or theology heavy. We have different flavors of shows around here, right? This episode right here, for the most part, will be philosophy heavy, but drawn from a Christian theological framework, right? I mean, that's what Christian philosophy is all about. It's the intersection between philosophy and the biblical worldview, taking the biblical worldview and addressing philosophical questions. That's what Christian philosophy is. But having said all that, I'll be introducing a number of terms that philosophers use as we kind of navigate, our discussion here on morality, and some of the other things that we'll get into later on, right? So on the previous episode, I want to say it was the one where I was at the No Ceilings Bible study talking about the problem of evil. Probably in that first segment of that, I talked about how philosophy, the study of philosophy, the field of philosophy, it's a lot like playing chess, right? And I was saying that if you sat down with a chess master, right, just the most genius chess player of all time, and they gave you just the most unstoppable strategy in chess known to man, right? That strategy wouldn't do you any good if you don't know how each chess piece moves, or if you don't know the basic rules of the game of chess, right? So, likewise in philosophy, it helps to know key terms and concepts and how they work in turn as we critically think about things and work through philosophical issues, problems, right? So that's kind of what we're going to be doing. Spending a little bit of time throwing out a couple terms there so we're all on the same page. Also, just as a heads up, I probably will word some things maybe somewhat awkwardly even, because I'm trying to take certain maybe technical terms and ideas and communicate them in a more common language, commonsensical kind of a way, All right. So, that's what it is. So my listeners will also remember, right? You've been following along. I've talked about worldviews quite a bit, right? Worldviews meaning, the lens through which you see the world. And I've talked about how it's kind of like a puzzle, and the puzzle pieces are like the sum total of all you believe to be true or real about the world. And when you put all that together, boom, that's your worldview, right? I think often with apologetics, apologetics is most effective when you're taking the biblical worldview and helping people to think through important or difficult questions, right? And when critiquing another worldview, one of the ways that we can go about it is to evaluate how that worldview is able to answer or stand up in the face of life's most important questions as well, right? And if you can help somebody become aware of the shortcomings in their worldview and to think critically about them, then you actually can open up the door to show how the biblical worldview solves the problem that their worldview isn't equipped to handle. That in and of itself can be an apologetic. You can show the deficiencies in their worldview and how the biblical worldview has an answer for that. Now, the important question that I'm taking up here, right, in this series is, does the Christian worldview have the resources within it to provide a solid framework for engaging moral or social issues or the negative conditions facing the Black community yesterday, today, and moving forward. That's what we're really trying to grapple with, right? We want to dispel the myth, that Christianity is this hyper forgiveness based, pie in the sky focused moral sedative, to the Black community, as Brother Polite and the folks like that, claim that it is. We want to demonstrate that that's false, because if that were the case, then it would be a knock against Christianity. It would be a chink in our armor. So we want to show that the Christianity doesn't fall victim to those kinds of criticisms, right? So for the remainder of this episode, along with a couple episodes to follow, I'll address that question, right? And so anyway, in trying to break down the main components of these worldviews, of course, I'll be talking about Christianity in this episode, but then these other worldviews in the next. But in breaking them down, I'll be using what I come across, what's called the MAKES model, MAKES, right? And MAKES is an acronym which stands for, the M stands for metaphysics, which is just a fancy word that has to do with, getting to the bottom of what exists, and often you have under that the question of, does a divine being exist? And if so, what is it like? That kind of falls under the category of metaphysics, what actually exists, what's the very nitty gritty of reality, right? The A stands for anthropology, which pertains to, what the worldview has to say about what or who we humans are, right? Why we're here, and so on, right? Then the K stands for knowledge. I probably won't spend a whole lot of time on that, but we'll touch on a little bit. The E stands for ethics, or morality. Those terms will be used interchangeably. So the E stands for ethics, and then the S stands for salvation, which refers to not only salvation in the Christian sense, or even just a religious sense more broadly, but more so how the worldview answers the human predicament, i.e., why is there evil in the world and what will be done about it, and so on. So yeah, there we have it. So you got, again, metaphysics, talking about, what exists, and under that category, you find that question of, is there a God and things like that, anthropology, knowledge, ethics, and salvation. So going back to our puzzle analogy, right? If a worldview is a puzzle, then each of these different components, the M, A, K, E, and the S, would represent or be analogous to the edges of the puzzle, right? So usually when you do a puzzle, you want to do the edges first because it's got those flat pieces, and then all the pieces in the middle, you're going to kind of fit them together based upon your having put this the edges or the outer frame in place, right? So the MAKES, that's going to be like our broader frame, and what you want to look at, with those being like your dominant components of any given worldview. As we're evaluating different worldviews, we want to see how individually and also when taken together, how these pieces fit together to answer or stand up in the face of life's biggest questions, right? And so what we'll find is that in some of the worldviews that we deal with, some of the different components conflict with each other in such a way as that they don't allow for them to answer some of these big questions, right? So in this episode, we'll be more so dealing with the Christian worldview, particularly the metaphysics part, dealing with the question of God and what that means in terms of us being able to engage moral issues. And then, as I said, we'll move forward from there and, discuss how different worldviews measure up. All right. So, let's go ahead and break it down right quick. All right. I think that makes makes sense to me. If it doesn't, just email me and I'll review it in the next, the next episode. Try it again. Right. So, concerning our biblical framework for social justice, right, as I've defined it, the first and most important of our building blocks is God. That's that metaphysics right there. Does God exist in the biblical worldview? Obviously, yes. Right. God exists specifically, God as he's revealed himself in scripture. Right. The Bible makes some important statements, about and actually points to certain truths, very important truths about this God, which come into play in terms of how the biblical worldview relates to our moral issues, including social justice. So as we bring God to the forefront here, as we bring our first building block into the picture, rather, let's talk about morality a little bit, and kind of see where that takes us. All right. So let's say that, let's take a situation that we might see in society today, right? Let's say that you're having a conversation with somebody about, one of these cases in which a police officer has shot and killed an unarmed black man, for what you and the person you're talking to both believe to be no good reason, like the Tamir Rice case or Philando Castile and so on. And the person you're talking to says, yeah, man, that officer had no right to kill that man. That was an injustice. It was wrong. Right. See, right there, the person you're talking to has made a moral claim. Okay. We're talking about morality here. That person has made a moral claim. Actually, in a sense, they've really made a moral claim on a couple of different levels. But let me break that down a little bit. Because first of all, or I'll put it this way, on one level, they're communicating to you that taking a life unjustifiably and unjustly was evil, right? In some sense, it is murder. Murder is evil. In other words, in taking the stance that they have on this issue you're discussing, they're assuming that in some way or another, there is a such thing as good and evil. And furthermore, that there are things that can be correctly categorized as being either good or evil, right? And they're saying things like partiality in the form of racism, murder, or injustice in general are properly understood as being evil, right? So that's on one level. They're making a moral claim in that they're saying XYZ is evil, okay? So on a second level, they're saying, the person you're dealing with is taking it to be the case that seeing as how injustice and murder is evil, the officer ought not to have done what they did. The officer was wrong, right? I guess the idea with the second level of this moral claim being made is that there's something that the officer should have done and yet failed to do, right? Now, the second level of the moral claim being made, about injustice or, unjust killing, whatever, is actually rooted in the first level about those things being evil, right? In other words, their statement about what the officer ought not to have done hinges upon a belief that the unjustifiable taking of a life, aka murder, is evil, right? So that's the second part. So not only is there such thing as good and evil, but then secondarily, they're based upon that, there are things that we ought to do and ought not to do, right? Those are two different levels of the moral claim being made, all within that one statement about what the officer should or shouldn't have done. But then thirdly, there's another level, right? The person is saying that taking the life of an unarmed black man for no good reason, they're assuming, rightfully so, they're assuming that the victim in this case has personal moral worth. In other words, human lives have value, and therefore there's something wrong about taking a life without good cause. Now, this is the sentiment behind the Black Lives Matter slogan. That's what that's all about, right? Now, at this point, I want to introduce the first three of our vocabulary words, right? Let's talk about moral values and moral duties along with intrinsic moral worth, right? And we're going to start with, values and duties, and then we'll go from there. Now, generally speaking, when philosophers refer to moral value, they're talking about principles or concepts that one might categorize as being either good or evil. So, for example, you got love, justice, fairness. These are all things that folks would consider to be good. They're virtues, right? On the other hand, you have malice, injustice, unfairness, right? These are things that folks rightly consider to be evil. Okay, so these are the kinds of things that we're referring to when we talk about moral values, right? So using our example from a second ago, when that person you're speaking with remarks about an unjustified shooting of an unarmed black man, they're assuming something about moral values. Their statement presupposes that injustice is evil. Okay, so that's the values part, right? Now, moral duties, on the other hand, when we refer to moral duties, we're talking about do's and don'ts. What should a person do, or what does morality obligate someone to do, right? That's what we're kind of talking about when we speak of moral duties. So whereas moral values have to do with, good and evil, moral duties have to do with right and wrong. What is the right thing to do and what is the wrong thing to do, right? So, just like any, field of study, some words are used in a standardized sort of way so that folks in the field are on the same page of understanding with one another, basically understanding one another and what they mean when they say this or that, right? So as you read, philosophers of morality, this is how they're using these terms. Moral values deal with what's good and evil, while moral duties has to do with, the rightness or wrongness of what we do, right? So again, going back to our example, with the conversation about police violence, to say that the officer should not have taken the unarmed person's life, that's a statement about moral duties. The action of taking a life unjustifiably was wrong, right? So that's that moral duties part. So we talked about moral values, briefly talked about moral duties. Just to introduce another term real quick, let's talk about intrinsic moral worth, right? And think about that word, right? Worth, W-O-R-T-H, worth. What is valuable, right? We talked about values, but again, when we're talking about worth, we're talking about what is valuable or not valuable, okay? In what sense is something valuable or not valuable, right? Generally speaking, philosophers will talk about two broad categories of worth, including intrinsic worth, which I've mentioned, and instrumental worth, right? Now, instrumental worth is, basically the value of a thing based upon what it can do or get for you, right? Something has instrumental value to whatever degree it is a means to an end, and you're obtaining something else. Money is like that. That's an example. Money has instrumental value, right? Having $1 million, in the bank right now, that'd be mighty nice. That'd be all right. I ain't balling like that right now, but I wouldn't mind it if somebody wants to drop $1 million in my bank account tomorrow. I'd be cool with that, right? But at the same time, that's because in our current economic system, the dollar or whatever currency, has value, right? But having $1 million in the bank won't do you any good if the economy crashes and let's say no currency is considered valuable and cats go back to like the barter system or something like that. Just imagine if we were to somehow, due to some global calamity, just forced to go back to being strictly an agrarian society in which it's all about producing and trading and so forth. Well, all of our current currency, would be worthless, right? You can't come to the market, try to buy something with $100 bill, if that economic system had collapsed, we're on this barter system thing, right? You would get stopped real quick, like, nah, you better come with some goats or something like that, US dollars ain't go cut it, right? Now, obviously, or at least I think it's, obvious to most people, human worth isn't like that, right? We don't have instrumental worth, at least not exclusively anyway, humans have intrinsic value, intrinsic worth. Things that have intrinsic value are not the kinds of things that have value in that they're a means to an end, but rather they are an end in and of themselves, right? So that's an assumption that's made by the person in our example. If the police officer, for example, opens fire at target practice and nails his target a couple of times, well, I can't imagine that there would be a whole lot of marching in the streets protesting that. However, at the same time, right, if that same officer empties a clip at point blank range with less than 2 seconds of riding up on a 12-year-old boy with a toy gun, well, that's a whole different story. And questions need to be asked because humans have intrinsic moral worth. Humans are valuable, intrinsically valuable, right? So, those are the main chess pieces. I talked about that earlier. Those are kind of like some of the, or at least some of the key concepts, that we're going to need to kind of take hold of to make sense of the rest of what we're going to get into. All right. So we covered a couple key concepts: moral values, what's good or evil; moral duties, what's right or wrong; what we ought to do, ought not to do; And then this notion of moral worth. What is valuable? What's less valuable, or maybe not valuable at all, right? Or in what sense is something valuable? We kind of talked about that a little bit, right? Now, interestingly enough, just kind of as an aside, as we're kind of working our way through this, I think if you really just think about it in terms of what we've covered so far, I think you can imagine how if a person has a flawed understanding of moral values or moral worth, then that will dictate, whether they end up on the right side or the wrong side of moral duties, right? Let me give an example right quick. So let's say that, all right, let's say you have that same police officer, right? I'm just going to use that example to stay consistent. So let's say you have a police officer and they're just like, man, just bump justice. It's us against them. These courts ain't locking cats up for real. They're not locking people up that they're supposed to. I'm about to be out here on my, Punisher mode or something like that. I'm like the Punisher out here, or, RoboCop or something like that. I'm judge, jury, and executioner out here. Boom, there it is. Suppression of crime is more important than justice. Just imagine if somebody, if an officer thought that way, right? If an officer, did think that way, then, we might imagine that they might fail in their moral duty, right? They might be more prone to committing an unjustified killing of somebody, right? Or maybe the officer's been on the field, or been in the field rather, just way too long, and they've just kind of lost sight of the humanity of the people that they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, and all they see is just criminals, right, who are of little value to society, just perpetrators, right? Well, again, you can see how such an officer would be more likely to fail in their moral duty in that situation and take a life that they ought not to have taken. Yeah, man. Worth, value, and duty, they all play off each other in that sense, right? That's something we'll come back to, but I just kind of wanted to throw that in there right quick. All right. So let's take the conversation further a bit, right? As we're introducing God as the cornerstone, building block of our biblical social justice framework. Okay, let's take a look at it. So the person you're dialoguing with is making moral claims, right? But now let's ask ourselves, what kind of moral claims are they making? Okay. To say that a police officer unjustifiably, killing an unarmed minority is wrong, what do they mean by wrong? In what sense do they mean that? Now, I'm going to introduce, two more terms here. And, listeners out there, you'll be glad to know that these are the last two terms that I'll be introducing, at least for a while anyway. But yeah, so, there are two broad categories of morality, okay, that we'll be looking at. Okay, you have subjective morality, and then there is objective morality. Subjective morality and objective morality. Now, by subjective, we're referring to, that which is relative to a person or persons. Okay, it's relative, right? Objective refers to, something that is true or is the case regardless of what any person thinks or feels about. No matter what their stance is on it, it just is what it is. Okay. So, let's say that, if I say that chocolate ice cream is better than vanilla ice cream, right? That's subjective. That's subjective. If someone comes along and says, no, Adam, you're wrong, vanilla ice cream is better. We can argue until we pass out, go back and forth of whether, chocolate or vanilla ice cream is better. But obviously that'd be, pretty pointless, right? There's no actual fact of the matter as to which one is better. It's just a matter of preference. It's subjective, right? On the other hand, 2 + 2 = 4. That's objective. Okay. No matter what anybody thinks about it, the fact of the matter is the quantity we call 2 plus the quantity we call 2 equals the quantity that we call 4. It's just a fact of the matter. Okay. So that's subjective and objective. Okay. That's the difference between the two. So let's take it back to morality, right? When we're talking about subjective morality, that is to say that moral values and duties hinge upon what a person or people has to say about it or what their stance is about any given thing. Okay. So for, someone who thinks that morality is subjective, they might say that, morality is all relative, on any given moral issue or claim, what's morally right for you may not be morally right for me, or what's wrong for you, may not be wrong for me, and vice versa, right? At best, morality boils down to personal opinions and a person's perspective on good and evil, right and wrong. And those opinions really carry no more weight than me saying that chocolate ice cream is better than vanilla. It's all just moral preferences, right? Now, folks who want to add a little bit of backbone to subjective morality, they might hold to the view that, society, right, determines what is good and evil, right or wrong. They might realize that making morality purely individualistic and subjective would pretty much make the world a free-for-all, with everyone, doing whatever they want to do. And, just given how humans tend to jack stuff up and, screw each other over for self-interest, that individualistic subjective view makes for this world being a pretty scary place to live in, right? Kind of a moral anarchy, maybe. So again, for that person, they may hold to a moral theory in which societies, as collectives, are where the buck stops for being the basis of morality. Societies through laws, social norms, and so on set the tone for, what's good, evil, right, or wrong. Now, given that in America, it was once socially acceptable and lawful even, that people who look like me were enslaved. I'm glad that everyone hasn't or, doesn't subscribe to this society-based subjective morality, But anyway, when it comes to people who believe that morality is subjective, those are the kind of views that you might, run into, okay? If morality is subjective, then perhaps morality is all relative to the individual. And, while we can make moral claims, expressing moral opinions, what seems good or evil or right or wrong to us, our moral opinions really don't extend beyond us in terms of carrying any weight concerning what others think about morality or what they should or shouldn't do. For those who extend subjective morality out to the societal level, the same kind of limitations would apply, when making moral claims. For example, if we think that slavery is wrong over here, but in Muslim-controlled areas of Libya right now, for example, Africans in that society are being trafficked as slaves. The person who holds to a society-based subjective morality would have to say that, well, slavery is wrong for us, but it's right for them. It used to be right here in America, but now it's not. And, but over there, it is what it is. Morality is subjective. And for them, slavery is all good. If morality is subjective, well, that's what it gets you. That's what you're looking at. All right. On the other hand, to refer to objective morality is to say that moral values and duties are what they are, no matter what anybody has to say about it or what their stance is, right? And similarly, we can talk about worth or value the same way. Either human worth is subjective, as in based upon what persons think, or objective, as in terms of humans are valuable and have worth no matter what anybody thinks about it, right? Subjective and objective, it applies to these moral categories, okay? And just for clarity's sake, when talking about objective morality, a common example folks use to illustrate it is the Holocaust. The Nazis were dead wrong, objectively wrong, for gassing 6 million Jews. And if morality is objective, then even if the Nazis had won World War II, took over the entire world and just persuaded everybody on the planet, that their murdering of the Jews was right, it would still be a moral fact, a fact of the matter that they were indeed wrong, right? So to bring it even closer to home, let's talk about American chattel slavery, right? This especially racialized system of chattel slavery that Africans were exploited by. Now, certainly among the conscious community, and really just about all African Americans, I'd say, chattel slavery was objectively wrong. It was wrong in the sense that even if the Southern states, the Southern Confederate states, had won the Civil War and somehow convinced abolitionists, in the North or wherever, that chattel slavery was right, they would still be dead wrong, for enslaving people and treating them like livestock, particularly on the basis of race. If if there is a such thing as objective morality and chattel slavery is wrong, then it's just wrong. Doesn't matter what we think or feel about it, no matter what our stance is on it. Wrong is wrong. That's all there is to it. So, subjective or objective? When somebody says that the cops shouldn't have killed the unarmed black man, or when they say that Black Lives Matter, they're not really saying, well, I think police murdering people is probably a bad idea, but to each his own. Or, yeah, Black Lives Matter in my opinion, but hey, it's all relative. No, nobody's saying that, right? As these conversations are going on in the black community, or just society at large, people aren't making those kinds of subjective moral claims when it comes to these social justice conversations. People are making objective moral claims. They're saying that when the officer shot unarmed, let's say Walter Scott, for example, when they shot Walter Scott 8 times in the back as he ran away, and it was, just, dead wrong, objectively wrong. And then when it went to trial, and in spite of clear footage of the incident, taken in broad daylight, in which it seemed to show that the officer, planting a taser on Walter Scott and the whole nine, yet initially that case was still declared a mistrial. People are saying there's something objectively wrong with our justice system. There's something objectively wrong about how that went down. Given how it's still difficult, it seems, to get justice in clear-cut cases of wrongdoing. There's something objectively wrong about that. Folks aren't saying, in my humble opinion, Black Lives Matter, or Black Lives kind of matter. I'm saying, no, they're saying Black Lives Matter, period, full stop. They're saying that they're making that statement as an objective claim, just like 2 + 2 = 4. Black Lives Matter. Black lives are valuable, and it is the moral duty of officers and citizens to respect that. Boom, in a discussion. That's the weight behind what people are saying. They're making objective moral claims, right? So the way that people are speaking on these issues, they're making these objective moral claims. That is to say, when it comes to moral values, duties, and worth, there are what we call moral facts. They're saying there's some things that are the fact of the matter, right? In the same way that 2 + 2 = 4 is a fact, there's a fact of the matter about lives being valuable, justice being good, injustice being evil, and killing unarmed black and men unjustifiably is a violation of moral duties. It's wrong. That's just, that's what people are claiming. There are just moral facts concerning these things, right? Now, if morality is objective, then these moral facts are fixtures of reality itself, in the similar way that mathematical truths and the laws of logic are. I'll probably get back to that in a second. Now, I certainly agree that there are moral facts, right? And that morality is objective. I don't believe that morality is subjective, right? Between subjective morality and objective morality, it seems to me that objective morality aligns with our deepest intuitions and the human experience, right? Just when we think about it, when a police officer takes life for no good reason, when that occurs, it just seems immediately obvious to me that that's just wrong, right? It's objectively wrong. And without some evidence or good argument to convince me that, murder isn't wrong, I think I'm within reason to hold that it is, right? I certainly can't fathom what evidence, someone could provide that would show that murder is morally okay, So it just seems to me that any reasonable person encountering a situation in which a life is indeed taken for no good reason would agree with me. It's reasonable to think that murder is wrong, right? If somebody disagrees with that, then I think we agree that something's probably wrong with them. They're mistaken about the moral fact that murder is wrong, right? So I suggest to you that these conversations we're having about police misconduct, systemic racism, injustice, social justice, and so on, it seems to me that these conversations revolve around objective moral claims And, you know, just that sense of objective morality. You know, people are saying that there are objective moral facts concerning all of these issues. And it's at this point that I think that's where God comes in. All right. Now, it seems to me, right, that if there are moral facts, if objective moral values and duties do exist, you know, in reality, then the best explanation for them is God, right? Now, some of my listeners might be familiar with, you know, the various different forms of the moral argument for God's existence. There's a variety of them. There's a whole family of moral arguments ranging from simple to, you know, really sophisticated versions. But I haven't really spent much time on it on the show, digging into it. So I'll just be providing the kind of simplistic version that I think I've used before, and other comments that I think that are undergirded by a number of arguments that we could make here. Okay. So, you know, sticking with our example, you know, how do moral claims about injustice point to the existence of God, right? Well, if somebody says that the police officer should not have killed the unarmed minority for no good reason, right? They're making, you know, the claim that, you know, murder is evil, right? Dead wrong, objectively evil. Well, if objective evil exists, let me take it back. So if murder is objectively evil, right, then that would suggest that there is a such thing as objective evil, right? Now, if objective evil exists, then that suggests that there must be a such thing as objective good, right? If there is objective good and evil, then that would suggest that there must be a moral law by which we can distinguish between objective good and evil. But then if there's an objective moral law, then I would argue that that suggests there's a moral lawgiver. And I'd say that the best explanation for who or what that moral lawgiver would be is God. All right. So, you know, let me say it more simplistically. If there's a such thing as evil, then that suggests that there's such thing as good. If there are such things as evil and good, then that would point to there being some sort of moral law to distinguish between evil and good. And if you have a moral law, then it makes sense, or that would point to there being a moral lawgiver from which that moral law comes from. Okay. Now, why should we suppose that the moral lawgiver is God? Well, I think there's a number of good reasons, but, you know, I'll just kind of, you know, touch on a few here. So, you know, first of all, when we reflect on our moral experience, right? Think about how, you know, on your day-to-day life, the way in which you encounter this moral reality. Okay. We experience moral facts as if they are commands, you know, do this or don't do that. Right. So, you know, just think about it. If you were walking along the beach and you saw some, you know, seaweed just laying around that had washed up on the shore, you know, you probably wouldn't really think much of it. You know, it's seaweed. It is what it is. It's laying around, whatever, right? However, if you're walking along and you see some seaweed laid out in such a way that is spelled danger, leave the beach immediately. Now, you wouldn't say, man, that's just weird. You know, how that seaweed just washed up here and spelled out those words like that. You know what I'm saying? I mean, you wouldn't think it was some act of nature that randomly spelled out this message, right? You know, of course not. You'd be like, yo, let me get up out of here. Obviously, somebody wanted me to get the message that it's not safe out here. You know, let me get out of here, right? It's reasonable to think that, you know, where there is a message, there must be a messenger, right? Now, in the same way, when I consider my deepest moral impulses, right, they present themselves as a command, you know, with this propositional content, if we want to, you know, get a little deeper with it, but they present themselves as a command. And from that, I think it's reasonable to infer or conclude that there must be a commander. In the same way that a message suggests that there must be a messenger, a moral command suggests to me that there must be a commander, right? As I heard, you know, an apologist say, I think it was Frank Turek, I think he put it this way, that commands comes from whose, not its, right? Commands come from whose, not its. They come from persons, right? The other side of that is, you know, just grappling with the sense of moral obligation, right? Thinking about moral duties. Well, obligations are the sort of things that you would owe to a person and be accountable to a person for, right? Now, someone might say that our moral obligations, the reason why we experience them as being, like commands, and obligations to one another, is that because we have this human obligation, to one another, and that can just account for the sense of moral duty that we have. But it's important to remember that, when we're talking about objective morality, if moral facts are true in the same sense that 2 + 2 is 4 is true, for my philosophy heads, in any possible world, any possible way that reality could be, moral facts are what they are as a part of reality itself, right? Therefore, these moral commands, can't be accounted for simply by just, human to human obligation. Okay. These commands transcend human to human obligation, and therefore must derive from some transcendent commander as well. Okay. So this idea of human to human obligation just doesn't account for this sense of moral duty, or moral duties rather, given that these moral duties are objective and a part of reality itself, right? They can't then be grounded in us. Okay, so we got moral commands and obligations pointing to transcendent commander and transcendent person to whom we are obligated, right? Now the next part, put it a little bit differently. We'll switch gears a little bit and introduce a couple more buzzwords here. Moral facts are what's called prescriptive rather than descriptive. Okay. Moral facts are prescriptive rather than descriptive. Okay. So when you think about like the laws of nature, like, the law of gravity, or, mathematical laws or even laws of logic, right? All those kinds of laws are descriptive. They describe things as they are, as descriptive. Okay. But, this moral law, on the other hand, doesn't merely describe things as they are. This moral law is prescriptive in that it prescribes things as they ought to be. A person ought to be loving and just rather than hateful, racist, or, something like that. I could choose to be a hateful racist, but independent of what I want to do, this moral law aspect of reality is prescriptive in that it compels me to not be that way. Now, if there is this moral law that prescribes how it ought to be and how I ought to behave, then we can look at it this way. The source of this moral law has intentions for how I am to be, morally speaking, right? Or more broadly, this source of moral prescriptions has intentions for how things should just go in general, right? Now, intentions are the kinds of things that persons have. Rational beings have intentions, right? So if these moral facts are a fixture of reality itself, and they are indeed moral prescriptions, pointing to how things are intended to be, then it makes sense to infer that there is a transcendent intender behind it all, right? If there's a way that things ought to be, then behind it all, there must be an order, if you will. There's somebody that intends for things to be such and such a way, right? Next point I'm going to make, if morality is objective, then, like I mentioned, that means that moral facts are a fixture of reality itself. And any way in which reality could have turned out, these moral facts would be exactly the same. Okay. In any possible world, murder, rape, racism, etc. are wrong. It just is what it is. These are moral facts. Moral facts are unchanging and unchangeable, no matter how reality could have turned out, right? Or we could just get deep and say that these moral facts are metaphysically necessary, to kind of throw that little word in there, right? But anyway, if that's the case, then it is reasonable to conclude that the moral standard or the source of morality is also unchanging and unchangeable, metaphysically necessary. And no matter how reality could have been or could have turned out, this source of morality and moral facts must be what it is. It is what it is and is unchangeable, right? Right. So, putting these different pieces together, right? As we're, dissecting what morality is, okay? We've been basically exploring something that is an aspect of our everyday human experience. And in doing so, and exploring this topic of morality, particularly objective morality, we've now stumbled across something pretty profound here, right? We find ourselves confronted with this transcendent, changeless, personal being who has intentions for how things ought to be, morally speaking, right? And this being makes moral commands toward us in accord with those intentions, right? And this being is also metaphysically necessary in the sense that it's impossible for this being to not exist in the way that it does exist, right? So now, who does that sound like? It sounds an awful lot like God, right? And actually, we can take a little bit further than that before we kind of wrap this up, right? Just really quickly. Now, I know some of my listeners would want to, raise an objection maybe at this point against God being the moral lawgiver by posing the so-called Euthyphro dilemma, which basically asks, does God will something because it is good, or is something good because God wills it, right? Actually, for those comic book fans out there or movie fans who watched the terrible movie, the Batman versus Superman joint, which was horrible, Lex Luthor actually throws this in there, or at least maybe a version of it. But anyway, the idea here is that both of those options, are undesirable for the theist, for a Christian or just somebody who believes in God, because if God wills something because it is good, then that would mean that there is a standard of goodness outside of God that he must conform to, and if that's the case, then that would mean that there's something higher than God, which would mean he wouldn't be the most high, right? So that's a no-go. Obviously, it's not a desirable option, right? But option B isn't really any better, because if something is good simply because God wills it, then that means that morality is arbitrary or on shaky ground. Because if that's the case, then God can just will anything to be good. Tomorrow he could just decide that saving lives is evil and murder is good, or something like that. If option B is the case, so for an objective moral standard, that's just not that's a no-go as well, right? So if option A and option B of this Euthyphro dilemma were our only two choices, then we'd be in pretty bad shape. You'd be in pretty bad shape. But fortunately, for Christian theists, we can offer a third option, that squashes this objection. In other words, the Euthyphro dilemma is a false dilemma. Instead of option A or B, we can actually put option C on the table. Okay. And our option C is that God does not will something because it is good, and something is not good simply because God wills it. God wills something because he is good. All right. So when, we say God is good, that isn't to say that God is like well behaved, as if there's some standard of goodness outside of God that he has to submit himself to, right? God is good in the same sense that I am Adam Coleman, right? God is himself is goodness. He is the standard of goodness, and he wills things that are in line with his own perfect moral nature, right? That's our option C. So, actually, interestingly enough, through this Euthyphro dilemma, which is posed as an objection, we can highlight another facet of who God is that makes him a plausible ultimate moral lawgiver, namely that he is the actual goodness itself. He is the good, okay, to put it in Platonic terms, right? So considering our moral experience, right, since there is this moral law that's a fixture in reality, this objective moral law that needs a lawgiver, a God who is a personal and rational being that has intentions for how things ought to go in his universe and issues moral commands that we encounter day to day in our moral experience, and who is himself the very essence and standard of goodness and morality, this God provides an explanation for why there is this objective moral law. Thus, it is reasonable, for us to affirm that if morality is objective rather than just subjective, then God is indeed the standard and source of morality. So it seems then that the Euthyphro dilemma is in fact a false dilemma. When a dilemma is proposed as an objection, then the way you overcome that dilemma is by providing a third option. And we see that the Christian can do just that, when presented with this objection. So, this is where you get like these, arguments for God's existence on the basis of morality, right? If there is a such thing as objective morality, then that would point to there being a God, because objective morality, as I've kind of alluded to, throughout last couple of minutes here, suggested there must be a God behind it, So, like one of the popular arguments would be like, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. However, objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. That's kind of like the rationale, behind that. Okay. So, basically if you have objective morality, then, the best explanation for the existence of objective morality is God, right? So, this is what we've arrived at just through philosophical reflection so far, right? But I do want to briefly breeze through a few scriptures by which we can see that the God of the biblical worldview, specifically, okay, fits the description of the kind of moral lawgiver that seems to be necessary in order for there to be objective morality, right? So we'll take another look at what that, what we said about intentions, commands, and moral perfection again, just real quick through a biblical lens, and then we'll kind of tie this up, All right, so let's hit these scriptures up right quick. All right, so as far as intentions go, starting there, it's obvious, that Yahweh has a way he intends for things to go down here, right? I mean, just from Jump Street, Genesis 1, God creates a place for mankind, puts Adam in the garden, gave him a job, created the first family, and he gives mankind a global assignment, along with rules to follow. It's just really clear that from Genesis to Revelation, God is working out a plan that involves or results in mankind doing what mankind was supposed to do, the way that God created mankind to do it for all eternity, right? God has intentions for mankind, right? Right. So, what about commands? And we talked about moral commands, how, we experience, moral facts, particularly moral duties. We engage them as if they're commands. And if there's moral commands out there, then that suggests that there must be a moral commander, right? So, how does the biblical God line up with that? Well, let's take a look right quick. Let's go to Romans chapter 2, verse 14. It says, for when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they are a law unto themselves, even though they do not have the law, right? Now, this one and other passages point to this notion that we are all made in the image of God, and in some sense or another are aware of God's moral expectations for us, through what theologians call general revelation. So, that's, one aspect of it. But then, of course, in addition to general revelation, right, where we can have this sense of, what God would have us to do or what we ought not to do, right? We also have God's special revelation, through Jesus Christ specifically, and through the scriptures themselves, which of course are full of, moral commands, right? Jesus himself, taught that the greatest commandments boil down to, love God, love people. I'm saying in a nutshell, so there we have, that moral commander that our philosophical reflection pointed to, right? And as evidenced by moral commands, both in terms of our experience, which lines up with perfectly with Romans 2:14, and then of course the special revelation that I talked about. But what about the moral perfection part? Do we have within the biblical worldview, reason to think that Yahweh, the God of the Bible, is this centerpiece or very essence of morality itself? So remember these, I was talking about how these metaphysically necessary moral facts, or, moral facts that are a fixture of reality, such that, no matter how reality could have, come together, these moral facts will remain unchanging and unchangeable, right? And I talked about how, that suggests that the source of these moral facts must, in the same way, be unchanging and unchangeable, no matter how reality would have turned out. And, given our response to the Euthyphro dilemma, would also likely need to be the very essence and standard of moral perfection. We talked about that. So where does the biblical God line up? All right. So, 1 John chapter 1, verse 5 says, now this is the message that we have heard from him and declare to you. Okay. That God is light and there is absolutely no darkness in him. Okay. Now, in this verse is very interesting. It says, it refers to light, right? And the author is using that word light to refer to goodness, holiness, moral perfection, and virtue, and so on. Now, notice the verse doesn't say that God has light. It says that God is light, right? Like I talked about before, God is good in the same sense that I am Adam Coleman. It also says in that verse that there is no darkness in him at all, right? So right there we have a scriptural reference or example to pull from, demonstrating that God within the biblical worldview is goodness. God is good in the same sense that I'm Adam Coleman, and in him there's no moral imperfection. Okay. Finally, in James chapter 1, verse 17, it says that every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of change. Okay. So again, that speaks to the changelessness of God. Okay. So he's not going to be morally perfect today and then, just a raving immoral lunatic tomorrow. I'm saying God is changeless, in terms of his essential nature and attributes. Okay. So, there's that unchanging moral nature that our moral source would need to have. Right. And, I don't have time to get into it here. But, maybe in the description, I'll kind of post some links, articles into some lectures or, something like that. They kind of get more into this. I've been referencing, that term metaphysically necessary a couple times here. And I wish I could go into it further, but I'll probably post a couple articles that'll, people can chew on and maybe get a more of a feel for what I'm talking about, right? Okay, and earlier, we talked about how in evaluating worldviews, I've suggested that there are some major components of worldviews that we can look at to see how they fit together to answer or address, life's biggest questions. Metaphysics, as in, what is reality? What is reality? What is real? What is reality actually like? Metaphysics, as in, what is real? What is reality actually like? And under that component, you get questions like, is there a God or not, and so forth, right? The second component, anthropology, what is mankind? Why are we here, and so on. The third component, knowledge, what does it mean to know something? How do we know that we know something? Of course, the next, the E in our model, ethics or morality. And then the last piece, salvation. What's up with this, jacked up world? Is there any ultimate hope or not? That's the makes model, that we've been, that I was talking about earlier, outlining those major components of worldview. And then among those big questions, that worldviews need to be able to answer, that really all worldviews have to give an account for if they're to be taken seriously, is this question of ethics, or morality. How should we live? How should we treat each other, right? Now, as far as what we're concerned about here, the biblical worldview has a solid foundation for morality and social justice, right? Thinking about the major components of our biblical worldview puzzle in terms of, thinking about the major components of our biblical worldview puzzle in terms of our metaphysics, of course, we have God, for sure, Yahweh, the God of the Bible. And this metaphysical component of our worldview is connected with the ethics part in the sense that God himself is the morally perfect standard, the source and very essence of goodness and morality itself. Okay. There's that intersection between our metaphysics and our ethics in that sense. Okay. He is the basis of moral values, and he accounts for our moral commands as we experience them. Right. So the metaphysical component of our worldview actually also intersects with our anthropology as well. We talked about how God has endowed mankind with intrinsic moral worth that is ultimately grounded in him, and he has intentions for mankind and reality as a whole, for that matter. So again, if morality is objective, and I would say that it is, in fact, my understanding is that most professional philosophers, would say that it is, right? That's what you find in the literature. But yeah, if morality is objective, then the biblical worldview affords us solid grounds or solid explanation for why that is the case. So when we're getting into these discussions about social justice and morality, with people from other worldviews, we can be confident that the biblical worldview affords us a firm foundation to back up our moral claims. Now, as a side note, just real quick, for my philosophically astute listeners out there, in mentioning moral commands, I'm merely referring to how we experience, the moral reality, rather than nailing myself down to some form of divine command theory, as opposed to a version of like, theistic, natural law theory or something like that. I'm not aiming to rule either of them out at this point. Just wanted to kind of throw that in there real quick. All right. So philosophically, okay, we've got good reason to affirm that God is a plausible or very strong explanation for the fact that objective morality exists at all. Okay. And, more specifically, as we consider the scriptural data, right, we see indications that the God of the Bible fits the description of that moral lawgiver that our philosophical reflection kind of pointed us to, But this same God, we talked about that command, that moral commander. I mean, he didn't just issue commands. This same moral lawgiver endowed mankind with intrinsic moral worth. I mean, he made us in his image, and then, sat back in Genesis 1 to declare that what he made was good. Man, it's just, the world would just have us believe that our value is tied up in just all sorts of things. I mean, that ultimately just aren't big enough to shoulder the weight of what we're really worth. What nation you belong to, or race, how much money you have, your talents, intelligence, looks, what other people say about you, and so on. But, actually our worth is grounded in God himself. He is the foundation of our value, in the same way that he's the foundation of objective morality, as we talked about, So anyway, as we were having discussions with folks, right, going back to our example, and you're talking with folks about, police brutality or whatever it may be, when people are making moral claims, right, particularly they're making these strong claims, like, in terms of this or that is wrong, or this or that is evil, in like an objective sense, this or that is objectively wrong or objectively evil, right? For there to even be objective morality, by which folks are making these moral claims, the biblical worldview positions us to navigate these things in a way that we have a firm foundation, i.e. God, that objective morality is grounded in, Now, the same cannot be said for every worldview. You know what I'm saying? All worldviews are not created equal, but we'll get to that, I think, next episode, right? So as I end this out right here, right, let's take a look at where we are so far. There's a lot of talk about social justice, swirling around society and in the body of Christ nowadays, right? And there's just a range of, different takes on it. But for me, given that, I'm an apologist, that's kind of my angle, and a key interest of mine is urban apologetics. And just doing what we do, as I've been talking about, a major component of defending the faith has to do with demonstrating that the Christian worldview is morally credible, right? For people of African descent, does the Christian worldview have the necessary resources within it to provide a solid framework for navigating moral and social issues of the past and present? That's you got to be able to tackle that, So far, I think we're off to a pretty dope start. You know what I'm saying? Resolving that issue, right? We took a look at the first and most important building block of our framework, and I explained that God provides a solid explanation and foundation for our objective morality, which is at the heart of the matter when we talk about people being outraged about police misconduct, systemic injustice, racism, and so on. But again, like I said a second ago, not all worldviews are created equal. And so before we move on to the other elements of biblical social justice, I do want to take some time in our next episode to do an overview of some of the worldviews that are gaining traction in the Black community, and talk about how their concept of God, or lack thereof, leaves them with no foundation for objective morality, or a very poor one at best. I'll be taking a look at atheism, Hebrew Israelism, Islam, Moorish science, and Kemetic science, right? And as I said earlier, we can evaluate worldviews based on how their components bear the weight of important questions like the ones related to morality and justice that this series is about. In comparison, I think that the biblical worldview comes out head and shoulders above these other worldviews when you put them on the chopping block and see if they stand up to scrutiny. So once again, man, y'all know what it is, man. I appreciate y'all for tuning in. And, definitely check me out on, Facebook.com, / Adam Coleman, Twitter.com / Scott Lane 7, Patreon.com / Adam Coleman. Certainly hit me up on iTunes where you can subscribe. We're just about to get on Spotify as well, so that'll be coming up for those who are my Spotify heads out there. Certainly hit us up at the YouTube channel. And, appreciate everybody riding along with me. As always, y'all. Love y'all, man. It's another episode in the books. Peace.